Good morning, my classmates. I decided to do my book review and a video presentation. My book review is on Tom Brokaw's The Greatest Generation, which is a really good book. Tom Brokaw used to anchor the NBC nightly news, so I grew up with Tom Brokaw in my home every night. Like, my dad was a everyday watcher of the nightly news. So, I'm very familiar with Tom Brokaw. And so in this book, Tom Brokaw talks about how NBC sent him out to do the 40th anniversary of the landing on Normandy, which we all know as D-Day. He met some of the veterans at that time, and then he went back 10 years later and did the 50th anniversary. And he realized at that time that that really was the greatest generation. So he wrote this fabulous book. And just some of the highlights of the book is in the spring of 1984, Tom Brokaw visited Normandy for the 40th anniversary of D-Day. D-Day, known as the Allied invasion of Europe, that actually marked the beginning of the ending of Hitler's Third Reich. In this book, Tom Brokaw tells many stories of the men and women who came to age during the Great Depression and World War II that went on to build the modern America as we know it. The funny thing about those young kids, they were 20 years old, they had grown up in the Great Depression, they were used to being somewhat deprived. I mean, we had the roaring 20s, but we all know we had the terrible 30s. And these young men and women, 18, 20 years old, they couldn't wait to sign up and go. I mean, they loved their country. So in the midst of a depression, or at the end of a depression, they were ready to run to war. And I think that's one of the things that make them the greatest generation. And as Franklin Roosevelt was first taking office, he's promising the New Deal, 15 million Americans out of work. But in Germany, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, led by Adolf Hitler, was seizing all political power, looking at taking over Austria. You guys gonna forgive my cat? Uh-oh. Okay, sorry. When our young Americans were reaching 18, the flames of war were all over the world. America was kind of isolating itself, not really wanting to get involved. We were sending supplies to Europe, and our Navy battleships were getting, well, not battleships, I'm sorry. Our cargo ships were getting, bombed by the submarines trying to reach Europe with supplies. A lot of people don't realize that was going on way before Pearl Harbor. And, so Hitler seizes power of Austria. Japan is continuing its brutal genocide on the Chinese. And in Russia, Stalin is sending everyone to Siberia. And then at the beginning of 1940, it was clear to all of us in America that we had to join this war, but we still were trying not to, honestly. And the majority of African Americans were still living in the states of the former Confederacy and remained second-class citizens. African American men were drafted and placed in segregated units, even as America prepared to fight a regime with core beliefs in the superiority of Aryan people. There's the irony in that, right? But on December 7th, we all know, 1941, the Japanese bomb attacked Pearl Harbor. Young men enlisted by the hundreds of thousands. Women learned to drive trucks and weld and got in the factories and did the men's work for the men to go to war. And many women, too, later enlisted and did a lot of great work, too. By 1944, 12 million Americans were in uniform, and war production was 44% of the national gross product. There were 19 million more workers than there were 5 years earlier. 35% of those workers were women, which in that changed society, because when the war was over, women didn't want to go back home. They wanted to stay in the workplace. We had found that we could work as good as men, right? And the whole nation was immersed in the war effort. We stopped making cars and started making tanks immediately. We transformed our factories, and it was a total war effort that I don't think we see today. We are a little bit spoiled as Americans today. We continue to make the things we love and let the military and private companies make the things we need. So I think that's what sets this generation apart from us. Also, the young Americans at this time constituted a generation birthmarked for greatness, a generation of Americans that would take its place in American history. Millions of men and women were involved in this tumultuous journey through adversity, achievement, despair, and when the United States entered World War II, the U.S. government turned asked of ordinary people to do extraordinary things. And Tom Brokaw just highlights all those things in this book, and he also speaks of individual war heroes, men and women. And also, once the war was over and everyone's returning home, you have to think it's close to the end of the 40s. The Civil Rights Movement is probably not quite born yet. African Americans went from fighting for their country to returning to a country where they were second-class citizens. And they were part of that generation, that great generation that fought for the civil rights and changed modern America. He speaks of, war heroes that came back from war that couldn't go into the same officers club, like the famous officers club in Norfolk, Virginia. The African American soldiers couldn't go in there when the white soldiers were there. So I think of this generation, born the civil rights movement, to become first-class citizens. In many, many ways, this generation did sculpture the America we know today. And in this book, that's what Tom really highlights. And he also highlights how it inspired him through the hard times of his own life. That no matter what you're facing, your challenges or whatever is ahead of you, you stand up and you face them and you handle them. So that is my book review of Tom Brokaw's The Greatest Generation. These guys were truly the greatest. I know that we saw, immediate enlistment after September 11th. I know a lot of my classmates may have been very young in 2001. I'm a little bit older, and I was 20 years old when September 11th happened. Tells you how old I am. So, yeah, men and women did enlist in probably hundreds of thousands then, but we're still in that quagmire, and 20 years later, we're fighting that war. These guys, they went in, they knocked that war out in an allied with France and Great Britain and even with Russia, and knocked out the Third Reich and got back home. But what they did differently, I think, is they stayed behind and they helped rebuild and restructure Europe. And Tom Brokaw just really does a great job of highlighting all those things in this book. I appreciate you guys being patient with me in my book review. I hope you enjoyed it. See you in class discussion.